The rain did not merely fall on the St. James estate, it assaulted it. A relentless, drumming deluge that turned the manicured gardens of Blackwood Manor into a blurry watercolor of gray and green. Inside, the silence was a heavy, living thing, thick enough to choke on. Violet adjusted the stiff white collar of her uniform, her fingers trembling slightly against the starch. It had been 10 years, yet standing in this hallway, surrounded by the scent of beeswax and old money, she felt like a child again, fragile, exposed, and terrified. To the rest of the staff, she was simply Miss Hale, the quiet new maid with the efficient hands and the eyes that always seemed to be looking at the floor. They didn't know that every corner of this mansion held a ghost of her memory. They didn't know that the grand mahogany staircase was where she had once tripped and scraped her knee, only to be bandaged by the boy who lived here. They saw a servant. They didn't see the girl who had once held the airs hard in her palm before the cruel machinery of class and circumstance crushed it into dust. Violet moved toward the library, her footsteps swallowed by the plush Persian runners. She was 30 now, though the mirror often told her she looked older. Poverty had a way of carving lines into a face that youth should have protected. Her hands, once soft, were now roughened by years of hard labor in diners and laundromats, scrubbing away the dreams she had once dared to dream. She had returned to Blackwood not out of hope, but out of desperation. A sick mother, a mountain of debt, and this job was the only lifeline left. But working here meant walking through a graveyard of her own history. The heart keeps its own calendar, marking time by the beats of a lost love. The library was a cavernous room of shadow and leather, smelling of tobacco and unread books. Thunder rattled the high, arched windows, casting spasmodic flashes of lightning across the room. Violet began to dust the mantel, her movements mechanical. She avoided looking at the grand portrait above the fireplace, but her eyes betrayed her. There he was, Hudson St. James. Painted 5 years ago, he looked like a titan of industry, imposing, handsome, and utterly devoid of warmth. She remembered a different Hudson, a boy with messy hair and ink-stained fingers who used to sneak out to the gardener's shed to read her poetry. That boy was gone, replaced by this cold, marble statue of a man. The rumors in the kitchen were that Hudson had become a recluse, a billionaire who managed his empire from the shadows of his estate, rarely seen and never heard laughing. They said he was heartless. Violet knew the truth. He wasn't heartless. He had just locked his heart away in a vault where no one, especially not a girl from the wrong side of the tracks, could ever hurt him again. She was wiping down the surface of a small, antique side table when the heavy oak doors creaked open. Violet froze. She didn't turn, her instinct to flee warring with her duty to stay invisible. The footsteps that entered were heavy, rhythmic, and deliberate. There was no hesitation in them. It was the walk of a man who owned the earth beneath his feet, but found no joy in the possession. "I gave specific instructions," a voice said. It was deep, resonating in her chest like the lower register of a cello, but edged with a wintry frost. "No interruptions after 6. Violet turned slowly, clutching her duster like a shield. Hudson St. James stood in the doorway, illuminated by a flash of lightning. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that seemed too strong for a man who simply signed checks. But it was his face that stole the breath from her lungs. The boyish softness was gone, replaced by sharp angles and a jawline that could cut glass. And his eyes, those stormy, blue-gray eyes, were empty. "I apologize, sir," Violet whispered, her voice barely finding traction in the dry air of the room. She kept her head bowed, praying the dim light and the years would be enough of a disguise. The storm. "I lost track of time while cleaning." Hudson didn't dismiss her immediately. He walked further into the room, moving with a predator's grace. He stopped near the center of the rug, the smell of rain and expensive scotch clinging to him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the window, watching the violence of the storm. "Leave the room," he commanded, his voice weary rather than angry. "The dust will still be there tomorrow. Unlike my patients." Violet nodded, turning quickly to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had survived the first encounter. He hadn't recognized her. She was safe. She was invisible. Some secrets are best kept in the open, hidden by the blindness of others. But as she reached for the brass handle of the door, a sudden, deafening crack of thunder shook the entire house. The lights flickered and died, plunging the library into absolute darkness. Violet gasped, an involuntary sound of fear that slipped out before she could catch it. In the pitch black, she felt a hand grip her arm, reflexive, steadying, and shockingly warm. "Stay still!" Hudson's voice came from right beside her, the distance between them vanishing in the dark. "The generators will kick in." His touch burned through the fabric of her uniform. For a second, just one terrifying second, the years dissolved. She wasn't the maid. He wasn't the billionaire. They were just Hudson and Violet, two frightened kids in a summer storm. The emergency lights buzzed to life, bathing the room in a ghostly amber glow. Hudson didn't let go immediately. He looked down at where his hand gripped her arm, then traveled up to her face. His brows knit together, a flicker of confusion disrupting his mask of indifference. He studied her features, the curve of her chin, the shape of her eyes, as if trying to recall a dream he had forgotten upon waking. "Do I?" Hudson started, his voice losing its command, softening into something dangerous. He searched her eyes, his grip tightening imperceptibly. "Have we met before?" Violet's heart stopped. This was the moment. She could say it. She could say, "It's me. It's Violet." But she looked at the expensive watch on his wrist, the grandeur of the room, and then at her own rough, red hands. The chasm between them was too wide to bridge with just a name. "No, sir," she lied, the words tasting like ash. "I'm just the new maid." Hudson stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, the silence stretching until it screamed. He slowly released her arm, the connection broken, but the suspicion in his eyes remained, burning like a coal that refused to go out. The days at Blackwood Manor bled into one another, a seamless, gray loop of servitude and silence. For Violet, the mansion was no longer just a workplace. It was a museum of her own heartbreak. She moved through the corridors like a phantom, her presence marked only by the gleam of polished silver and the scent of lemon oil. She learned to breathe shallowly, to make herself small, to become part of the architecture rather than a living, breathing woman. Hudson St. James, however, was a storm that refused to settle. Since the night of the blackout, the air in the house had shifted. He was restless. Violet would feel his gaze on her back when she cleared the dinner service, a heavy, physical weight that made her skin prickle. He wasn't looking at her with the disdain of a master for a servant, but with the bewildered intensity of a man trying to solve a riddle in a language he had forgotten. One Tuesday evening, the tension that had been simmering finally began to boil. It was late, past midnight. The rest of the staff had retreated to their quarters, leaving the great house in a slumbering quiet. Violet was in the kitchen, finishing the final polish of the crystal glasses, her hands aching from the repetitive motion. The service bell rang, a singular, sharp note that echoed through the empty kitchen. The library. She prepared a tray with a fresh pot of black coffee and a single crystal tumbler of water, exactly the way he took it. Walking the long, shadowed hallway to the library, her reflection in the darkened windows looked like a stranger, a tired woman in a black dress, carrying a silver tray, miles away from the vibrant girl who used to race Hudson through these very halls. Memory is a ghost that refuses to be evicted. When she entered the library, Hudson was pacing. The room was choked with the smell of old paper and anxiety. Documents were scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, the debris of a business deal gone wrong. He looked up as she entered, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man drowning on dry land. "Leave it," he muttered, gesturing vaguely to the desk. He didn't dismiss her immediately this time. He walked over to the window, staring out at the expansive, dark grounds. "The silence in this house," he said, his voice low, almost as if talking to himself. "It's louder than the city." Violet set the tray down with agonizing care, terrified that the clink of china would shatter the fragile atmosphere. She should leave. The rules were clear: do the job, disappear. But seeing him this way, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his empire, tore at the carefully constructed walls around her heart. "Silence is only heavy when it's full of things unsaid, sir," Violet replied. The words slipped out before she could stop them, a sentence too poetic, Too familiar for a simple maid. Hudson froze. He turned slowly, his blue-gray eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. That was something she used to say. The old Violet, the girl who loved poetry. He walked toward her, closing the distance until he was standing just a foot away. The scent of him, sandalwood and rain, filled her senses, dizzying and painful. The contrast between them was stark. Him in his bespoke linen shirt, the fabric costing more than her life's earnings. Her in the stiff, scratchy uniform that marked her as property of the estate. Yet, in that pool of lamplight, the class divide seemed to blur, overshadowed by the magnetic, undeniable pull of their shared past. "You speak differently," Hudson observed, his voice rough. He wasn't accusing her, he was studying her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before dropping to his side, a restrained gesture that screamed of inner conflict. "Who are you, Miss Hale? You walk these halls as if you know the floorboards. You make the coffee exactly how I used to like it years ago." "I am just observant, sir," Violet lied, her voice trembling. She gripped her apron, her knuckles white. "I need this job. I try to be efficient." "Efficient," Hudson repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, challenging her retreat. "Efficiency doesn't explain the way you look at the portrait over the mantel. It doesn't explain why, when I look at you, I feel like I'm seeing a ghost." The air between them crackled with electricity. It was the forbidden fruit of a connection that shouldn't exist. A billionaire and a maid, standing in the heart of a mansion, bound by a history one couldn't remember and the other couldn't forget. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes, searching for a spark of recognition. Violet wanted to scream the truth. She wanted to tell him that she was the ghost, that he had broken her, that she was still in love with him. But the shame of her poverty, of her fall from grace, held her tongue. The truth is a prisoner of fear. Hudson sighed, running a hand through his hair, stepping back as if the proximity was burning him. "Go," he whispered, the single word heavy with defeat. "Get out." Violet fled the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. But in her haste, she made a fatal error. As she turned, the pocket of her apron snagged on the corner of the heavy oak desk. A small, folded piece of paper, a sketchbook page she had been drawing on during her break, fluttered silently to the floor, landing face up on the Persian rug. She didn't notice it fall. She closed the heavy doors behind her, leaning against the wood, gasping for air. Inside the library, Hudson stood alone in the silence. He looked down, his eyes catching the white square of paper against the dark wool of the rug. He bent down and picked it up. It was a sketch, a charcoal drawing, rough but incredibly detailed, of a young boy sitting in a garden, reading a book. The boy was unmistakably him, but it was a version of him that hadn't existed for 15 years. And in the corner, in a handwriting that hit him like a physical blow to the chest, were the initials VH. Hudson stared at the paper, his hands beginning to shake. The impossible realization began to dawn, a sunrise of fire and ice. The mystery of the maid was no longer just a curiosity, it was a key to a door he had locked forever. The woman who had just left the room wasn't a stranger. She was the echo of a scream he had been suppressing for a decade. And now he had the proof. The game of shadows was over, the hunt for the truth had begun. The sketch of the boy in the garden burned a hole in Hudson St. James's pocket. For 2 days, he carried it like a weapon, or perhaps a prayer, unsure of whether to use it to destroy the silence or to beg for the truth. The atmosphere in Blackwood Manor had shifted from melancholic to suffocating. Every time Violet entered a room, the air grew heavy, charged with the static of unspoken accusations. Hudson watched her, truly watched her now, not as a servant, but as a cipher he was desperate to decode. He saw the way she paused by the rose garden window, the way her hands trembled when she poured the wine, the terrified grace of a woman walking on a razor's edge. Violet felt the walls closing in. The missing page from her sketchbook was a ticking bomb, but she didn't know when it would detonate. She only knew that Hudson's gaze had changed. It was no longer the bewildered look of a man seeing a ghost. It was the sharp, analytical stare of a man who realized he had been deceived. She considered running, packing her meager bag and vanishing into the rainy night, but the debt collectors calling her mother's phone were a chain she couldn't break. She was trapped in the gilded cage, waiting for the executioner. Hope is a cruel architect. It builds bridges only to watch them collapse. The breaking point arrived on the night of the autumn gala. The manor was a kaleidoscope of silk gowns, diamond chokers, and hollow laughter. Violet was tasked with serving champagne in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with exotic orchids, and the sound of rain hammering against the panes. It was a place where she and Hudson had once hidden from the world, sharing secrets in the humid, earthy air. Now, she navigated the crowd of wealthy strangers, invisible in her black uniform, a shadow serving light to those who had never known darkness. As the guests began to migrate toward the ballroom, the conservatory emptied. Violet stayed behind to collect the discarded flutes. She was reaching for a glass on a marble pedestal when the doors locked with a distinct, heavy click. She spun around. Hudson stood there, blocking the exit. He was dressed in a tuxedo that fit him like armor, but his face was stripped of all social pleasantries. He looked devastated, furious, and devastatingly handsome in his pain. In his hand, he held the crumpled piece of sketchbook paper. "Violet," he said. He didn't ask a question. He stated her name as a fact, a verdict. It was the first time he had spoken it aloud in 10 years. The sound of it, shaped by his voice, shattered her composure instantly. "Hudson," she whispered, the tray trembling in her hands. "I can explain." "Explain." Hudson laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that had no humor in it. He walked toward her, stepping over the threshold of propriety, ignoring the class divide that the uniform represented. "Explain why the girl who swore she would never leave me is scrubbing my floors. Explain why you stood in front of me, looked me in the eye, and lied. You let me believe you were a stranger. You let me question my own sanity." "I had to," Violet pleaded, tears welling in her eyes, hot and stinging. "Look at me, Hudson. Look at what I've become. I couldn't bear for you to see me like this. Broken. Poor. I wanted you to remember the girl in the garden, not the maid." Hudson stopped inches from her. The anger in his eyes warred with a desperate, lingering affection. "I never cared about the money, Violet. I cared about us. You left. You vanished without a word. And now you return, hiding in plain sight." He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek, a touch that was both an accusation and a caress. For a heartbeat, the misunderstanding seemed poised to dissolve. He was close, so close, and the years of pain seemed to evaporate in the heat of his proximity. A secret revealed as a wound reopened. But the fragile moment was violently interrupted. The side door of the conservatory swung open, admitting a gust of cold air and a woman who radiated ice. It was Victoria, Hudson's fiancée, a calculated union of corporate empires, a woman as sharp and unyielding as a diamond. She didn't look surprised. She looked triumphant. "Oh, Hudson," Victoria drawled, walking in with a sleek, predatory gait. She held a manila folder in her hand, tapping it rhythmically against her thigh. "Don't tell me you're falling for the sentimental act. It's truly pathetic." Hudson stepped back, the spell broken. "Victoria, this doesn't concern you." "Doesn't it?" Victoria smiled, a thin, cruel curve of red lips. She tossed the folder onto a nearby table. It slid across the marble surface, spilling its contents: bank statements, loan shark notices, and a detailed report on Violet's family debts. "I did a little background check on your new staff, darling. Standard procedure. It seems Miss Hale here is drowning in debt. Gambling debts from her father, medical bills. She's desperate." Victoria turned her cold gaze on Violet, dissecting her worth with a single look. She didn't come back for love, Hudson. She came back because she heard the St. James air was lonely and vulnerable. She's not a lost love. She's a gold digger in a maid's uniform, waiting for the right moment to cash in on a childhood memory. Violet gasped, the air leaving her lungs. "No, that's not true. I didn't know. I just needed a job." But the damage was done. Hudson looked at the papers, seeing the staggering numbers, the desperation printed in black and white. Then he looked at Violet. The softness in his eyes hardened into a shield of absolute, impenetrable frost. The betrayal he felt was not that she was poor, but that her motive seemed tainted. He saw the debt as the cause, and her silence as the strategy. "Is this true?" Hudson asked, his voice dead. "Are you in this much debt?" "Yes, but..." Then Victoria is right, Hudson cut her off, turning his back to her. The rejection was physical, a wall slamming down. You didn't return for me. You returned for a savior. And I am done saving people who lie to me. Hudson, please. Violet reached out, but he flinched away from her hand as if it were fire. Leave, Hudson commanded, staring out into the rainy darkness, refusing to look at her. Take your things and leave this estate tonight. If you're still here by morning, security will escort you out. Violet stood frozen, her heart shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The truth that she loved him enough to hide her shame had been twisted into a lie of exploitation. She looked at Victoria's smug victory, then at Hudson's rigid back. There was no fighting this. She had lost him twice now, once to fate and once to a lie. With a sob she couldn't suppress, Violet turned and ran from the conservatory, fleeing back into the shadows, leaving the only man she ever loved believing she was a monster. The separation was absolute, agonizing, and built on the cruelest of foundations. The great oak doors of Blackwood Manor slammed shut, sealing out the storm and the woman who had just run into it. But the silence that followed was not peaceful, it was deafening. Hudson stood in the center of the conservatory, the echo of Violet's sob hanging in the humid air like a physical weight. Victoria was already pouring herself a glass of champagne, the triumphant click of the crystal flute against the bottle sounding like a gavel striking a judge's bench. Well, Victoria sighed, smoothing her dress. That was unpleasant but necessary. You really must be more careful with the help, Hudson. Desperation makes people ugly. Hudson didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked down at the scattered papers Victoria had thrown, the evidence of Violet's ruin. He saw the numbers, the overdue notices, the mounting interest. But as his eyes traced the lines, something caught his attention. A detail that his anger had initially blinded him to. The dates. The medical bills for Marion Hale, Violet's mother, predated the gambling debts. The loans weren't for luxury, they were for survival. And the most recent document, a final notice from the bank, was dated 2 days before Violet had started working at the manor. The truth often hides in the details we are too angry to see. He turned his gaze to the window, where the rain was swallowing the world. If she was truly a gold digger, a master manipulator playing on his nostalgia, why hadn't she mentioned the money? Why had she worked in silence for weeks, scrubbing floors and polishing silver, when she could have played the lost love card the moment she arrived? A manipulator would have used the memory as leverage. Violet had used it as a hiding place. She didn't ask for anything, Hudson said, his voice low, the ice in his chest beginning to crack. She was biding her time, Victoria scoffed, dismissing the thought with a wave of her hand. It's a long con, darling. No, Hudson said, sharper this time. He turned to Victoria, his eyes cold. Leave us, Victoria. I need to be alone. Hudson, really, you can't be. I said leave. The command was absolute. Victoria stiffened, her mask slipping for a fraction of a second, before she set down her glass and stormed out, leaving Hudson alone with the ghosts of his own judgment. He didn't stay in the conservatory. Driven by a gnawing instinct, Hudson climbed the servants' stairs, a part of the house he hadn't visited since childhood. He walked down the narrow, dimly lit corridor to the room assigned to Miss Hale. The door was ajar. Inside, the room was stark, stripped of personality. The bed was made with military precision. Her uniform hung neatly in the open closet. She had taken nothing that belonged to the house. But on the small, scratched nightstand, she had left something behind. It wasn't a request for money. It wasn't a letter of explanation. It was the rest of her sketchbook. Hudson approached it like it was a holy relic. He opened the cover, his fingers tracing the worn cardboard. The pages were filled not with schemes, but with memories. Sketches of the garden as it looked 10 years ago. A drawing of him, sleeping in the library chair, dated just last week. And on the final page, a drawing of the two of them, divided by a wall of rain, with a caption written in her delicate script. Some distances cannot be crossed, only endured. A knock at the door startled him. It was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, a woman who had served the St. James family for 40 years and had never been known to cry. But tonight, her eyes were red. Sir, Mrs. Gable said, clutching an envelope. Miss Hale. Violet. She left this at the back door. She refused her final wages. Hudson took the envelope. It was heavy with cash, the wages for the month. She had walked out into a storm, penniless, carrying a mountain of debt, rather than take a single dime from a man who thought she was a thief. The realization hit Hudson with the force of a physical blow. The narrative Victoria had spun dissolved into ash. Violet hadn't come back to take from him. She had come back to earn her survival, terrified that her poverty would taint his memory of her. Her silence wasn't manipulation, it was dignity. She had chosen to be the maid he ignored rather than the beggar he pitied. "She's walking," Mrs. Gable whispered, voicing the horror that was already rising in Hudson's throat. "The last bus to the city left 20 minutes ago. She's walking to the station in this storm." Hudson didn't speak. He didn't think. He simply moved. He sprinted down the servants' stairs, the envelope of cash crushed in his hand, the sketchbook tucked under his arm. He burst out of the heavy front doors, ignoring the valet, and jumped into his car. The engine roared to life, a beast awakened by regret. The drive down the long, winding estate road was a blur of rain and headlights. The storm was violent, snapping branches and flooding the tarmac. Hudson leaned forward, his eyes scanning the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Don't be gone. Please, don't be gone." He found her a mile from the gates. She was a small, solitary figure trudging along the muddy shoulder of the road, her head bowed against the wind, her thin coat soaked through. She looked like a tragedy painted in gray. Hudson slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet leaves before coming to a halt. He threw the door open and stepped out into the deluge. The rain soaked him instantly, ruining the tuxedo, washing away the Billionaire facade. "Violet!" he screamed, his voice tearing through the wind. She stopped. She turned slowly, her face pale, her hair plastered to her cheeks. When she saw him, she didn't run toward him. She took a step back, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of love and shame. "Go back, Hudson," she yelled over the thunder. "You made your choice. I was wrong." Hudson closed the distance between them, oblivious to the mud ruining his shoes, oblivious to the cold. He stopped just inches from her, breathing hard. "You returned the money. You walked away with nothing." "I have my pride," Violet said, her voice shaking, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "I didn't come here to steal your life, Hudson. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and because being near you, even as a shadow, was better than being anywhere else in the light." The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. "I looked at the papers, Violet," Hudson said, his voice breaking. "I saw the dates. I saw your mother's name. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe the lie?" "Because 10 years ago, I wasn't good enough for you," she whispered, the old wound finally exposed. "And looking at me now, a maid with nothing but debt. I knew I was right. I wanted to protect you from the burden of me." Hudson reached out, and this time he didn't pull back. He took her freezing, trembling hands in his. "You are not a burden," he said, the words fierce and absolute. "You are the only real thing in a world of counterfeits. I have spent 10 years locked in that mansion, protecting a heart that stopped beating the day you left. I don't care about the debt. I don't care about the past. I care that you are here, now, and I am not letting you walk into the dark alone again." He pulled her toward him, not in a rough embrace, but in a desperate need to shield her from the storm. Violet resisted for a second, her pride warring with her heart, before she finally crumbled, sobbing into his chest. Hudson held her tight, resting his chin on her wet hair, closing his eyes. The storm raged around them, but in the circle of his arms, the silence was finally broken. The reconciliation had begun, not with a check or a grand gesture, but with the simple, terrified admission that they were both drowning, and only together could they learn to swim. But as the headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the long road ahead, they both knew that the morning would bring realities that love alone might not be able to fix. The drive back to Blackwood Manor was a journey through a transformed world. The storm outside still raged, thrashing against the sleek metal of the car, but inside, the silence had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of secrets kept in the dark, but the exhausted, peaceful silence of a war finally ended. Hudson drove with one hand on the wheel, the other firmly clasping Violet's ice-cold fingers, refusing to let go as if he feared she might dissolve into mist if he broke contact. When they arrived at the estate, the grand entrance was blazing with light. Mrs. Gable stood by the open doors, her usual stoicism replaced by a look of profound relief. She didn't guide Violet to the staff quarters. Instead, she led her directly to the master suite, drawing a bath filled with steaming water and lavender, a scent from a summer 10 years ago. Violet emerged an hour later, wrapped in a thick, cashmere robe that swallowed her small frame. She walked down to the library, the very room where she had dusted shadows just days before. The fire was roaring in the hearth, casting long, dancing figures on the walls. Hudson was there, standing by the fireplace. He had changed into dry clothes, a simple sweater and trousers, stripping away the armor of the billionaire completely. On the low table between them lay the file Victoria had thrown, the catalogue of Violet's ruin. "I made a call," Hudson said softly, not turning from the flames. "Victoria will not be returning to Blackwood. The engagement is dissolved. It was a merger, not a marriage, and I find I no longer have a stomach for business that costs people their souls." Violet approached him slowly. The warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, chasing away the chill of the rain, but she still felt the tremor of the reality shifting beneath her feet. "And the debts?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. Hudson turned then, his eyes dark with an emotion that transcended simple generosity. He picked up the stack of papers, the bank notices, the medical bills, the chains that had bound her to servitude. With a deliberate, slow movement, he tossed them into the fire. "Paid," he stated, watching the edges curl and blacken, the numbers turning to ash. "Not as a gift, Violet, and not as charity." He moved to her, taking her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of worry that the years had carved there. "Consider it restitution. For the years I spent locked in this tower, blind to the struggle of the only person who ever made me feel alive. You paid for your mother's life with your youth. Let me pay for your freedom with my fortune. It is the only thing this money is good for." Violet watched the papers burn, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. It wasn't the money that broke her, it was the acknowledgement, the validation of her sacrifice. She wasn't being saved by a prince, she was being honored by a partner. "I don't want to be a guest, Hudson," she whispered, covering his hands with hers. "And I can't be a maid. I need to be me. I need to paint again. I need to find the girl who left the sketchbook in the garden." "Then find her here," Hudson promised, pressing his forehead against hers. "This house has been a museum of ghosts for too long. Fill it with life. Fill it with paint. Fill it with whatever you need." In the weeks that followed, Blackwood Manor underwent a metamorphosis. The stiff, cold atmosphere that had defined the St. James legacy began to thaw. Violet didn't disappear into the role of the idle mistress. She set up a studio in the conservatory, the light filtering through the orchids where she had once been mocked. She painted the gardens, the storm, and she painted Hudson, not as the titan of industry, but as the man who ran into the rain. The scandal sheets whispered, of course. They spoke of the billionaire and the maid, a Cinderella story twisted by rumors of secrets and shadows. But inside the gates, the noise of the world faded. They found a rhythm born of second chances. They learned that love wasn't about the grand, dramatic gestures of youth, but about the quiet intimacy of being known. One evening, as autumn gave way to the first crisp bite of winter, they stood together on the balcony, overlooking the estate. Violet rested her head on Hudson's shoulder, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of purple and gold. "Do you remember what I used to say?" Violet asked softly, watching the light fade. Hudson tightened his arm around her. "I remember everything. The heart keeps its own calendar," she recited, the leitmotif returning one last time, no longer a lament of lost time, but a celebration of timing. Marking time by the beats of a lost love. "It wasn't lost," Hudson corrected her, turning to kiss the top of her head. "It was just waiting. It was keeping time in the dark until we were brave enough to bring it into the light." The journey had been brutal. They had navigated the crushing weight of poverty, the arrogance of wealth, and the blinding pain of misunderstanding. But as the first stars appeared above the manor, Violet realized that the shadows they had feared were not cages, but cocoons. They had to be broken, they had to be lost, and they had to be stripped of their pride to find the naked truth of their connection. The maid who had scrubbed the floors now owned the heart of the house. Not because she had conquered the billionaire, but because she had saved the man beneath the title. Hudson took her hand, the hand that had worked, and bled, and sketched, and raised it to his lips. In that simple gesture, the history of their forbidden love was rewritten into a future of boundless possibility. She had walked into his mansion as a ghost serving a memory, but she would remain as the living soul who taught the master of the house that the only true currency in this life is the courage to be seen.